I grew up in Aurora, Colorado, with parents who seemed to think worrying was a full-time job. They were convinced I wasn't ready to live on my own.
I don't care what you heard, just listen to me.
They
They
list
know
off
I'm here.
scenarios in this anxious chorus.
Look, you need
You'll
to move
forget
the
to
money
lock
now,
the door.
or it's over.
You'll open up for the wrong person and get robbed. Maybe it came from things they'd gone through, or maybe they just couldn't picture me functioning as a real adult. Whatever the reason, it got under my skin. I wanted to prove them wrong more than anything. So when I turned 20 in June of 2023, I grabbed the first real chance I had to move out. I found a tiny studio apartment not far from Aurora Community College, where I was taking classes part-time. It was nothing special: creaky front door, beige walls, a cramped little kitchenette. But it was mine. That was the magic. For the first time, I felt like I was living on my own terms. The first couple of weeks were normal. I picked up cheap furniture off Craigslist and from IKEA, slapped some posters on the walls, and tried to make the place feel cozy. My TV was the same old boxy thing I'd had for 10 years. Tinny, crackling speakers, and a screen that flickered if the bass got too low. I decided to sell it on Craigslist and use the money toward a bigger TV with decent sound. I listed it for $75, which I thought was fair. Within a few hours, I had several messages, most of them offering roughly what I'd asked. Then one reply stuck out. A guy named Henry said he'd pay $100, no questions asked, and wanted to pick it up right away. That bothered me. In the ad, I'd said I was open to negotiating, but he didn't even try. Who volunteers to pay more than the asking price on Craigslist for no reason? My parents' warning started echoing in the back of my mind. My first thought was to text my friend Leela and ask her to hang out at my place while Henry came over. Safety in numbers. But then that stubborn part of me kicked in, the part that wanted to show everyone, including myself, that I could handle living alone. It was broad daylight, just a guy buying a TV. I talked myself into believing it would be fine. Henry and I set a time, 11 o'clock a.m. the following Thursday. That morning, I cleaned up the apartment and set the TV by the door so it would be easy to move. Around 10:30, I texted Henry to confirm. No response. An hour went by, still nothing. Eventually, I gave up, annoyed that I'd stayed home for a no-show. Days passed. I thought about selling the TV to someone else, but school and midterms got in the way. Then, on Sunday night, June 25th, I remember it exactly. I was about to climb into bed when my doorbell rang. It was just before midnight. Instantly, every nerve in me went on alert. No one ever dropped by unannounced, and certainly not that late. A second later, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Henry. I'm at your door." "Sorry it's late," my heart stuttered. I walked quietly to the door and glanced through the peephole. 3 men stood there. I recognized Henry's face from the tiny profile picture he'd sent me, at least enough to feel sure it was him. The other 2 were larger, broad-shouldered silhouettes in the dim hallway light. Every instinct I had screamed that something was wrong. I texted back quickly, "Too late to do this now. Can we do it in the morning?" "Okay," he replied almost immediately. "I'm so sorry. I'll come by tomorrow at 9 o'clock a.m. I could hear them talking in low voices outside. After a tense few seconds, their footsteps retreated down the hall. I waited several more minutes before moving away from the door. My knees were shaky, and I realized my hand hurt from how tightly I'd been gripping my phone. The whole thing was undeniably weird, showing up unannounced at midnight with 2 extra guys. But they were gone, and I tried to convince myself it was just poor judgment on his part. I brushed my teeth, shut off the lights, and crawled into bed. Around 2 o'clock a.m., just as I was drifting off, a violent pounding shook the door. It sounded like someone hurling their body against it. My stomach emptied out. Every hair on my neck stood upright. I froze, listening, hoping it would stop. It didn't. The blows came harder, faster, until I heard a sharp crack, the sound of wood splitting. That was when it clicked. They were trying to break the door down. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the front of the apartment. Before I could get close, a section of the door frame snapped and the door flew inward. slamming against the wall so hard I stumbled backward. In the weak light spilling from the hallway, I saw Henry first. He was in front, his face twisted into something urgent and wild. Behind him were the same two men from earlier, even bigger now that they were actually inside my home. I let out a panicked yelp, spun around, and sprinted to my bedroom. I slammed the door, locked it, then bolted straight into the bathroom and locked that door too. 2 layers between me and them, flimsy, but it was all I had. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to dial 911. The dispatcher's calm, practiced voice was the only thing keeping me grounded. I whispered that men had just broken into my apartment and rattled off my address. They were inside. I could hear them moving around, opening drawers, bumping into furniture. One of them yelled something I couldn't make out, then a series of heavy thuds, either on my bedroom door or the hallway closet, I couldn't tell. Everything blurred together in a mess of sound. Minutes crawled by like hours. Eventually, beneath the chaos in my apartment, I heard faint sirens approaching. Then shouting outside, orders being barked, "Get down," echoing through the hallway. Silence followed. After a moment, I eased the bathroom door open and stepped back into my bedroom, then out into the living room. Police officers were already there. One of them guided me out into the hallway, away from the wrecked doorway. My front door hung crookedly off what was left of the frame. Inside, my things were scattered and overturned. The sight barely felt real, like I'd walked into someone else's apartment. Later that night, an officer explained what had happened. They'd caught Henry and the 2 other men just as they were trying to run with a bag full of my stuff. My laptop, some video games, even a few pieces of cheap jewelry. My old TV still sat by the entrance, half wrapped in an old blanket I'd left out, cords dangling. It all felt detached and dreamlike. The officer went on to explain that Henry and his accomplices had already raised suspicions in a few other Craigslist meetups, but they'd never been caught in the middle of anything. Their usual tactic was to bait people, especially women, by offering more than the asking price. Once they knew someone would be home alone, they'd show up at an odd time and try to ease their way in. If that didn't work, they weren't above breaking down a door. They'd been doing it for a while, around Denver and Aurora. Hearing that, my stomach dropped. I realized how ready I'd been to ignore every red flag just to prove that I could handle living on my own. I'd wanted independence so badly that I'd talked myself out of being cautious. At one point, the officer handed me a pair of earrings they'd found on the sidewalk, dropped, apparently, as Henry's group tried to run. His expression was almost apologetic. "You got lucky," he said quietly. "We showed up at just the right time." I nodded, still half numb. My legs felt rubbery. My thoughts came in scattered bursts. What if I'd opened the door at midnight? What if I hadn't made it to the phone in time? What if they'd reached me before the police did? The rest of the night blurred into paperwork and questions, giving my statement, signing forms, listening to my landlord curse under his breath about the ruined door. By the time everyone left, dawn was seeping into the sky. I sat in the living room, staring at the jagged edge where the door used to latch properly, and my parents' voices rose up in my mind, clear as day. All those warnings I'd brushed off suddenly felt justified. "You can't be too careful," my mom always said. She'd been right. Maybe they simply understood the world better than I did. Maybe I needed a harsh lesson to make that sink in. That sense of vulnerability has never really gone away. Some nights when the building settles and the walls creak, I lie there wondering if someone is outside my door, testing the frame, checking the lock. It isn't paranoia so much as awareness, knowing that people like Henry and his friends actually exist, scanning for easy targets. That's the part that sticks with me, how normal Henry seemed at first. Friendly texts, a plain, ordinary name, polite phrasing, not a single overt threat, up until my door exploded inward. You never really know who's on the other side of those messages. And the worst part is, I almost opened the door for them myself, just to prove a point. Before we get into the next story, if you're new here, Make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss any of our upcoming scary stories. I always wanted to be a quarterback. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, I dreamed of throwing game-winning passes under the Friday night lights. My dad, a retired Army captain, had other ideas. He believed in discipline above all else. He saw something in me, but not a football career. By the time I was 18, instead of trying out for a college team, I was enrolling in the local police academy. I'd traded one uniform for another. I still sometimes wonder what might have been, but over time I settled into law enforcement. I liked the structure, the rules, the sense of purpose. My dad and I argued plenty, but he was openly proud when I pinned on a badge. I worked my way up to a detective position with the Phoenix Police Department, focusing on organized crime. In May of 2007, I made an arrest that pushed my name onto the local news. Around 2:00 a.m., near the edge of Maricopa County, I spotted a white Chevy Suburban idling without headlights. A tip from an informant had already put me on edge that night, so I followed my gut and pulled the vehicle over for a traffic stop. The driver was Ronnie "Red" Alvarez, the rumored leader of a violent burglary ring that had been hitting neighborhoods across the area. The stop escalated fast, but I managed to get Alvarez in cuffs by myself. It felt like the law enforcement equivalent of intercepting a pass in the final seconds of a championship game. Not long after that, things in my personal life took a turn I never saw coming. My wife Ava and I have a son named Connor. He was 9 at the time. One afternoon, about a week after Alvarez's arraignment, Connor didn't come home from school. At first, I figured he'd stayed late for soccer practice. When I called the school office, they said they hadn't seen him leave with anyone. My stomach twisted. I drove straight there, tore through the hallways, talked to every staff member still on campus. Nothing. I issued an alert immediately. Colleagues jumped in to help, and a citywide search kicked off. The department worked around the clock with us, posting bulletins, pulling security footage, looping in the local FBI field office. Every resource we had went into finding my son. Days went by with no trace, no sightings, no calls, no ransom demands. I'd never known fear like that. My chest felt hollow. I barely slept. Each hour that passed without an answer carved a little more out of me. On the 6th day, we caught a break, or what felt like one. A tip suggested Alvarez's crew might have orchestrated the kidnapping as retaliation for his arrest. His gang had connections everywhere. Fueled by pure adrenaline, I chased every lead, leaned on old informants, and pushed harder than I ever had in my career. Every trail either dead-ended or fizzled out. Nothing concrete, no faces, no demands. It was as if my son had been erased. The nights were the worst. Lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling fan, I blamed myself. Alvarez was locked up, but maybe this was their lesson for me. The guilt settled in my chest like a stone. Ava did her best to keep us both together, but we were drowning in helplessness. 10 days after Connor disappeared, I was in our bedroom, going through old case files, convinced I'd missed something. Ava had gone to stay the night with her sister. She needed a break from our house, from the constant dread in the air. Sometime around midnight, I heard a soft thump from downstairs. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was nothing. Houses make noise. I was exhausted and jumpy. Then came another sound, louder this time, from the direction of the basement. The basement door is in the hallway off the kitchen. I hadn't been down there in days. I pictured a burst pipe, toppled boxes, anything dull and practical. I grabbed a flashlight and went down the steps slowly, each tread creaking beneath my feet. At the bottom, I flicked on the overhead light. Everything looked normal at first. Shelves stacked with photo albums, holiday decorations, plastic storage bins. Then I heard a muffled whimper. It came from behind a row of boxes in the far corner. My throat went dry. I edged around a broken old coffee table we'd stored down there and aimed the flashlight into the shadows. Connor was there. He was on the floor, wrists and ankles tied with rough rope, an old cloth gag strapped around his mouth. His eyes locked on mine, terrified and relieved at the same time. I almost dropped to my knees. Terror, rage, and relief crashed over me in one wave. But I forced my hands to stay steady long enough to untie him and pull off the gag. He clung to me, shaking so hard I could feel his heartbeat hammering against my chest. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was hoarse. He told me he'd been picked up from school by our housekeeper, Jackson. Connor knew Jackson as a friendly fixture in our home. We'd hired him months earlier through a domestic services agency because Ava and I both worked long hours. At first, nothing seemed off. Then Jackson started driving somewhere Connor didn't recognize. Eventually, Connor was locked in a dark place. He had no idea where it was. All he remembered were snatches of conversation, voices mentioning me, something about getting even. Adrenaline surged through me. I ran upstairs with my gun drawn and swept through every room. No sign of Jackson. I called the station, forcing my voice to stay level as I explained what I just found. Within minutes, squad cars surrounded our house. Officers searched the property inside and out. Jackson was gone. It was like he'd evaporated. Over the days that followed, the truth came out in pieces. Jackson had never worked for any legitimate agency. Every document we had on him was fake. He had targeted us, embedded himself in our home, specifically to get close to my family. His real name wasn't Jackson at all. He was an ex-con with known ties to Alvarez's crew. This had been planned from the beginning. It took nearly 2 more weeks of non-stop searching to track him down. A local hiker in the Tonto National Forest reported suspicious activity near an old hunting cabin off an unmarked trail. Someone had been slipping in and out of a structure that wasn't even on official maps. My partner and I led a small team out there at dawn. The cabin was half collapsed, with rotting roof shingles and shattered windows. We approached in silence, weapons drawn. The air felt like it did right before a big play on the field. Only now the stakes were life and death. Inside, we found Jackson alone, rummaging through boxes of stolen goods. He lunged towards something, probably a weapon, but we converged on him fast. In seconds, he was on the ground in cuffs. When I finally stood face to face with him, he stared at me without saying a word. No shouting, no begging. Just a calm, flat expression that chilled me more than any threat would have. Back at the station, Jackson stonewalled us. He denied everything. Alvarez stayed quiet behind bars. Eventually, the case was folded into a much larger investigation into the entire network. I had my son back. For that, I was grateful beyond words. But the damage was done. Connor couldn't stand to be alone in a room. Ava flinched at every unexpected noise. We put our house on the market because staying there felt impossible. Every creak in the floorboards sounded sinister. Every shadow seemed to hold someone watching. Sometimes, late at night, my mind goes back to that traffic stop. Taking Alvarez down had felt like a career-defining victory, but it came with a cost I will never stop paying. His people had used my own home as a piece in their game. What haunts me most is the question that still has no answer. How many others were involved? How many people I'd walked past every day, nodded to, even trusted, were part of that same web? That thought wakes me up more than any nightmare. When a floorboard settles or my phone buzzes unexpectedly, I get that old spike of adrenaline because I know there could still be others out there, watching from the sidelines, waiting. Maybe they're just names in case files, or maybe they're blending into ordinary life like Jackson did, playing the role of a harmless helper until the moment they decide to strike. I keep replaying how easily he slipped into our lives, acting like a dependable, unassuming maid. If it could happen once, what's to say it couldn't happen again? And if I, a trained detective, was fooled under my own roof, what chance does everyone else have? That's the part that still unsettles me most. I used to work the night shift at a small warehouse just outside Sacramento, California. I started in April of 2022. My hours were 10 o'clock p.m. to 6 o'clock a.m., which honestly wasn't that bad. Nights were quiet, almost peaceful, just me and a couple of coworkers handling orders, packing boxes, and sorting inventory. My boss, Mike Evans, was the type of guy you immediately trusted. Late 40s, glasses, always neatly dressed in a button-up and jeans. On my first night, he shook my hand, gave me a firm smile, and walked me through the building himself. He made a point of checking in on us, bringing coffee or snacks and asking how we were doing, and actually listening to the answers. I liked Mike, everyone did. For months, the job was simple and predictable. I'd clock in, grab a cup of coffee, get to work, and chat with coworkers in between tasks. Mike usually stayed until around midnight, making sure everything ran smoothly before heading home. By mid-August, something about him started to change. He began staying later 1, sometimes 2 in the morning, alone in his office with the blinds drawn. At first, we figured he was buried in paperwork, but the longer he lingered, the more distant he became. His easy smiles faded. His jaw seemed permanently tight. Sometimes he'd sigh in irritation over minor issues he used to shrug off. One night in September, around 3 in the morning, I stepped out back for some air. The lot was dark and cold, my breath hanging in front of me. That's when I noticed Mike's truck. Instead of parking near the entrance like he always did, he tucked it way out near the far edge of the lot, partially hidden behind a row of dumpsters. I squinted through the darkness and realized he was sitting inside, lit by the dim glow of the dashboard. He had his phone pressed to his ear and was clearly arguing with someone, his free hand cutting through the air in sharp gestures. His face was twisted with anger, an expression I'd never seen on him before. I slipped quietly back inside, not wanting him to know I'd seen anything. I told myself it was probably something personal. Everyone has bad nights. But from then on, things only got stranger. Mike started showing up at odd hours, sometimes not appearing until well after midnight. He'd go straight into his office, close the blinds, and stay there. He grew short-tempered, snapping at people for tiny mistakes. The man who used to show up with donuts barely looked anyone in the eye. Rumors started spreading. Some coworkers whispered about unfamiliar visitors coming in near dawn, when most of the staff had already left. One guy, Alex, swore he'd seen Mike loading sealed boxes into the back of unmarked vans around 4 in the morning, passing them off to men he'd never seen before. It sounded shady, but this was Mike, Mr. Reliable. I chalked it up to boredom, sleep deprivation, and gossip. Still, that nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't quiet down, especially after what I'd seen behind the dumpsters. Late October, right before Halloween, I stayed late to help clear a backlog of orders. It was about 4:30 a.m. The warehouse was dead quiet. As far as I knew, I was alone. I was wheeling a load of boxes toward the loading bay when I heard low voices coming from Mike's office. His door was cracked open an inch or two. I moved closer, my heart picking up, and peeked through the gap. Mike stood by his desk with 2 rough-looking men I didn't recognize. They were hunched over, counting stacks of cash spread out across the desktop. A lot of cash. Mike's expression was cold and focused, no trace of the friendly boss I thought I knew. My stomach dropped. I eased back from the door and hurried to my workstation, forcing myself to look busy, taping up boxes with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. After a few minutes, the office door opened. The 2 men walked out through the back exit, each giving me a quick, assessing glance as they passed. Mike never emerged from his office again that night. When my shift ended at 6, I left without saying a word to him. The next time I worked, Mike was all smiles again, cheerful greetings, casual jokes, cups of coffee handed out like always. It was surreal watching him slide so easily back into that persona. For a while, I convinced myself I'd misinterpreted things, that there had to be an explanation. But the image of those stacks of money and the strangers in his office at 4:30 a.m. wouldn't go away. Not long after, Alex quit abruptly. He just said he needed a change and barely said goodbye. It felt like he knew more than he was willing to share. Then, One night in November around 3:45 a.m., I was alone again, finishing up inventory logs. Mike hadn't come in at all that night, which wasn't unusual anymore. The loading dock door creaked open. My heart jumped. No deliveries were scheduled. Heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse, slow, deliberate. I ducked behind a tall shelving unit and wrapped my fingers around the handle of a box cutter. The footsteps moved toward the row of offices. I heard keys jingling, then the soft click of a lock. I risked a glance around the edge of the shelf. It was Mike. He looked nothing like his neat, collected self. His hair was mussed, shirt wrinkled and untucked. He unlocked his office door and slipped inside, leaving it slightly ajar. Seconds later, crashes and thuds came from his office, drawers slamming open, the sound of papers scattering across the floor. He was tearing the place apart, searching frantically for something. My mouth went dry. If he realized I was there, I had no idea what he might do. After several tense minutes, he rushed out, clutching a thick envelope to his chest. He scanned the empty warehouse with wide, nervous eyes, then hurried out to his truck. He never came back. From that night on, calls to his phone went straight to voicemail. Rumors flew through the staff. He'd fled to Mexico, he'd crossed the wrong people, he'd been taken care of. No one knew for sure. Eventually, the police showed up at the warehouse. They questioned us about missing shipments and anything strange we'd seen Mike doing. Apparently, he'd been using the place as a hub for stolen goods and had gotten in over his head with some very dangerous people. Months later, I left that job too. I couldn't shake the feeling that one day someone would walk through those doors looking for Mike, or for something he'd promised them, and decide that any of us would do instead. Even now, when I'm alone late at night, my mind goes back to Mike. The warm smile, the coffee runs, the fatherly concern. And then the other version of him, the man hiding in the shadows of his own office, dealing with criminals in the middle of the night. What unsettles me most isn't just what I saw, it's what I never fully understood. Mike lived a double life, and I only ever saw the respectable half clearly. The other side was just a dark outline behind drawn blinds. It makes me wonder more than I'd like. How well do we really know the people we trust? I'm writing this in January of 2021, a little over a year after it happened, and even now, thinking about it ties my stomach in a knot. My name is Darren. Back then, I lived just outside Syracuse, New York. I was finishing my senior year of college and working part-time at a local grocery store. In late November of 2019, my friend Mitch sent me a link to a post on an online forum. It was about an abandoned building near downtown, a former textile warehouse that had gone bankrupt decades earlier. The post mentioned strange noises people claimed to hear from inside at night. Some said it was rats, stray dogs, or the wind. Others hinted at squatters. I've always been drawn to old, forgotten places. There's something about their emptiness that pulls me in, like a puzzle begging to be solved. Who worked there? What happened? Why was it left to rot? Mitch and I decided to check it out on a Friday night. We both knew it was a dumb idea, trespassing, falling through floors, running into someone who didn't want company. But we told ourselves we'd just step inside, look around, and leave. That evening, we parked a block away on a deserted side street. The air was cold enough that our breath hung in front of us, the sky a dull, washed-out gray. The warehouse itself was massive, 5 stories of crumbling brick and broken windows, tagged with layers of graffiti. The front doors were secured with a heavy chain and padlock, but we found a gap in a broken side window large enough to squeeze through. Inside, the building smelled like mildew and stale air. Our flashlights carved narrow tunnels through the dust drifting in the dark. Chunks of drywall littered the cracked concrete floor. Rusted machinery sat abandoned in corners like relics. We instinctively lowered our voices to a whisper. It felt wrong to talk normally in there, as if the walls were listening. We explored the first floor cautiously, watching for weak spots in the concrete. There were old offices with collapsed ceilings, yellowed papers scattered everywhere, and busted desks shoved against the walls. In one room, I found a ledger dated 1978 detailing shipments of fabric. Holding that ledger made the place feel more real. These weren't just ruins. People had come here every day, typed at those desks, shuffled those papers. And then one day, it all stopped. We decided to check out the upper levels. Near the back, we located a narrow metal staircase. Every step groaned under our weight, the sound echoing uncomfortably loud in the emptiness. On the second floor, we stepped into a huge open area lined with rows of overturned sewing tables. The windows were shattered, letting in a constant draft. Strips of plastic hung from the rafters, flapping and rustling like ghostly banners. The whole place felt stuck in time, frozen in the moment it had been abandoned. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave right then, but the other part, the curious part, pushed me onward. We found an elevator shaft with the doors partly open. The elevator itself was gone, nothing but a vertical pit of darkness. Mitch tossed a chunk of debris inside. We counted several seconds before it clanged against something far below. We made a mental note to give that area a wide berth. Things got unsettling on the third floor. Almost immediately, we noticed footprints in the dust, clear impressions cutting through the thick gray layer. They weren't ours. The prints led down a hallway that branched off to the right. We followed them, our flashlight beams wobbling slightly. I wasn't exactly scared yet, but my senses were sharpened, expecting to run into someone at any moment. Another explorer, maybe a few squatters, something explainable. The hallway bent around a corner. At the far end, a door stood slightly ajar. A thin sliver of outside light leaked in through a broken window nearby, catching on something metallic on the floor near the door. We stopped. The footprints that had been so clear behind us simply vanished a few feet before the doorway. They didn't fade gradually, they just stopped. There were no side rooms or cracks in the wall someone could have ducked into, just blank, dusty floor. I felt my heartbeat crawl up into my throat. The only sound was a faint drip of water somewhere behind us. Mitch nudged my arm and pointed to the ground near the door. There, lying on its side, was a flashlight. I picked it up and pressed the switch. The bulb flickered weakly but still worked. Before I could say anything, a dull scraping noise came from further down the hall, somewhere near that half-open door. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across concrete. We both froze. Mitch motioned for me to turn off my flashlight. I did, plunging us into near-total darkness. We stood there, holding our breath, listening. The scraping continued, slow and methodical. My eyes adjusted enough to see the outline of the door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, but no light came from the room beyond. Just a flat, impenetrable black. For a second, I thought about calling out. Maybe it really was just a person in there. Maybe they needed help, but something in that sound, the steady, deliberate drag, told me to stay quiet. Then, abruptly, the scraping stopped. Silence filled the hallway. Mitch didn't say a word. He just jerked his head back the way we came. Normally, I might have argued, insisted we at least peek inside, but my gut had already made the decision for me. We backed away slowly, trying not to step on anything that would make noise. As soon as we rounded the corner and the doorway slipped out of sight, we moved faster. By the time we reached the stairwell, my hands were shaking. We practically ran down the stairs. On the first floor, we nearly slipped on broken drywall in our rush to get out. Once we were outside, we hurried to the car without looking back. Only when we were locked inside with the engine running did I finally speak. "Did you see anyone in there?" I asked Mitch. He just shook his head. We drove home mostly in silence. Neither of us suggested going back. We never mentioned the place to anyone else. Later, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a homeless person or a scavenger dragging a pipe or some scrap metal. Maybe the footprints had actually kept going and we just lost them in the low light. It was all explainable, I told myself. But two things keep bothering me. One, the way those footprints seemed to just end, like whoever made them had stepped off the floor and disappeared. And two, that flashlight on the ground still working, weak, but not dead. Why drop a working light in a place like that and walk away in the dark? unless you didn't walk away by choice.